August 14, 1945. The air over the small coral outcrop in the Ryukyu Islands is thick enough to choke, a stagnant mixture of salt spray and the copper tang of blood. The sun sits low, a bruised purple against the horizon, casting elongated, distorted shadows over a landscape that has been chewed by naval bombardment and scorched by flamethrowers. Deep within a limestone crevice, the silence is heavier than the shelling ever was. For Corporal Sato and the 3 men remaining under his command, the world has narrowed to the damp walls of this cave and the rhythmic, hollow drip of groundwater. They are skeletal, their uniforms reduced to tattered rags of tropical wool, their skin a jaundiced yellow from malaria and malnutrition. In the distance, the low, constant thrum of American diesel engines vibrates through the earth, a sound like a heartbeat that is not their own. It is the sound of an industrial titan that has finally cornered its prey. The transition from the feverish heat of the cave to the blinding light of the clearing is not a choice, but a finality. Their ammunition is gone. Their bayonets are notched and rusted. For months, these men have been fed a steady diet of spiritual steel, told that the Yamato spirit would overcome any material deficiency. They were instructed that the Americans were kichiku, demonic beasts who took no prisoners, or worse, who practiced unspeakable mutilations on those who surrendered. To Sato, the concept of a prisoner of war did not exist. There were only the dead and the disgraced. As they crawl toward the jagged entrance of the cave, the grit of coral sand beneath their fingernails feels like the last sensation of the living. They expect the rapid stutter of a Browning machine gun to greet them, a quick, violent end that would at least preserve their honor in the eyes of a distant emperor. Instead, they are met with a silence that is terrifying in its stillness. Emerging into the light, their eyes, long accustomed to the darkness of the subterranean, struggle to focus. They see the shapes of men, tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in clean olive-drab fatigues. These are the victors. The Americans do not rush forward with bayonets leveled. They stand at a distance, their weapons held across their chests in a posture of watchful readiness rather than bloodlust. The contrast is visceral. Sato looks at his own hands, shaking with tremors of exhaustion, and then at the boots of the American soldiers, sturdy, leather, and unbroken. To the Japanese soldier, surrender was a descent into a void where humanity ended. They knelt in the dirt, necks bared, waiting for the blow they were certain was coming. Every muscle was tensed for the impact of steel, every thought a frantic prayer for a swift transition to the Yasukuni shrine. They were men who had already died in their own minds, now simply waiting for their bodies to catch up to the fact. Yet the air remained still. The only sound was the rustle of the wind through the charred palm fronds and the distant rhythmic clatter of a mess kit, a sharp metallic chime that cut through the heavy atmosphere of dread like a bell in a graveyard. This was the threshold of an entirely different world. The weight of indoctrination that pressed down upon Corporal Sato and his men was not a mere set of military orders. It was a totalizing spiritual architecture. To understand the terror of the men kneeling in that coral clearing, one must understand the Senjinkan, the field service code issued by War Minister Hideki Tojo in 1941. Its most chilling directive, "Do not live to endure the shame of imprisonment," had been woven into the very fabric of their identity. In the Japanese imperial military culture of 1945, there was no conceptual space for a survivor who had laid down his arms. To surrender was to sever oneself from the ancestral line, to become a non-person, a ghost whose name would be struck from village records back home. This was the Gyokusai ideology, the beauty of the shattered jewel. It taught that 1,000 men dying in a suicidal charge was more precious than a single man surviving to see the dawn of a new era. For years, the Japanese soldier had been conditioned to view the conflict not as a struggle between nations, but as a cosmic battle between divine purity and Western decadence. Propaganda films and pamphlets depicted Americans as kichiku, a term that translated literally to beast man. They were told that Americans lacked the spiritual fortitude to fight fairly and would instead resort to sadistic rituals if they ever captured a son of Nippon. Rumors rippled through the ranks of GIs using Japanese skulls as ornaments or dragging prisoners behind tanks. To Sato, the tall men in olive drab were not soldiers of a sovereign nation. They were the literal manifestation of the demons described in the folklore of his youth. This indoctrination created a psychological prison far more restrictive than any physical stockade. This ideological conditioning served a grim strategic purpose. By making surrender unthinkable, the Japanese High Command ensured that every island would be a fortress of the dead. It meant that even as the skeletal remains of the 32nd Army were pushed into the sea, they fought with a ferocity born of absolute despair. There was no hope for victory, only the hope for a sincere death. This was the atmosphere into which Sato and his men emerged, a mental landscape where mercy was a foreign concept and kindness was viewed as a tactical trap. As they watched the Americans approach, they did not see the liberators of Europe or the defenders of democracy. They saw the executioners of their souls. They waited for the Americans to confirm their worst fears, for the brutality of the beast man to manifest, completing the cycle of destruction they had been promised since the day they were drafted into the service of the sun. The reality of the front line by late 1945 was a study in absolute logistical asymmetry. As the American island-hopping campaign surged toward the Japanese home islands, the structural collapse of the imperial supply lines became a slow-motion catastrophe. For the men on the ground, the war was no longer about territory or tactics. It was a grueling struggle against the elements and the creeping onset of starvation. Factual records from the period indicate that by the time of the Okinawan campaign and the subsequent mopping-up operations in the surrounding islands, nearly 60% of Japanese military deaths were attributable not to combat, but to disease and hunger. Sato's men were living evidence of this disintegration. They had survived for weeks on a meager ration of cycad nuts, which required meticulous leaching to remove their natural toxins, and whatever insects could be scavenged from the jungle floor. Their bodies had begun to consume themselves, the muscle wasting away until their joints protruded like knots in a piece of driftwood. In stark contrast, the approaching American force represented a phenomenon the Japanese soldier could barely comprehend, the arsenal of democracy in full, terrifying bloom. While Sato's unit shared a single rusted canteen and husbanded their last few rounds of ammunition, the horizon was frequently crowded with the silhouettes of hundreds of American transport ships. These vessels were floating warehouses, carrying everything from heavy artillery to refrigerated units filled with fresh meat and ice cream. This logistical gulf was a psychological weapon in its own right. The Japanese High Command had predicated the war on the idea that Westerners were soft and lacked the Yamato Damashii, or Japanese spirit, required for a long war of attrition. However, the reality on the Pacific Front proved that the American capacity for industrial production was matched by a relentless, methodical persistence. The tactical situation for the holdouts was hopeless. The United States Navy had achieved total sea and air supremacy, effectively orphaning thousands of Japanese troops on bypassed islands. These ghost garrisons were left to rot in the sun, ignored by the main thrust of the Allied advance. For those who were engaged, the American method of warfare was one of overwhelming material application. If a cave was occupied, it was not stormed with infantry. It was sealed with bulldozers or cleared with liquid fire. The sheer volume of steel and high explosives leveled at Japanese positions was calculated to save American lives, yet it reinforced the Japanese perception of their enemy as a mechanical, unfeeling monster. As Sato knelt in the clearing, he was a witness to the end of a world. The disciplined, stoic army that had once swept across Southeast Asia had been reduced to a collection of hollow-eyed survivors, staring up at a force that possessed not only more guns, but more of everything. The clatter of the American mess kit, once a distant and mocking sound, was now the only tangible proof that life, sustained by an abundance they had been told was a myth, still existed on the other side of the fire. The moment of capture was not the explosive climax of violence Corporal Sato had anticipated, but a jarring encounter with a level of calm that bordered on the surreal. As the GIs moved closer, their shadows stretching across the coral like dark, reaching fingers, the expected hail of bullets did not materialize. One American soldier, a man with a soot-streaked face and eyes that held a weary depth of experience, stepped forward. He did not raise his rifle. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his combat jacket. Sato's breath hitched, his body instinctively tensing for the draw of a pistol or the click of a detonator. He closed his eyes, bracing for the end, only to hear the soft, crinkling sound of paper and foil. When he opened them, the American was holding out a small, rectangular object wrapped in dark paper. This was the introduction of the symbolic object, a simple Hershey's chocolate bar. To the American GI, it was a mundane ration, a small piece of home carried in a cargo pocket. To the Japanese soldier, it was an alien artifact of impossible luxury. Sato stared at the silver foil as it caught the dying afternoon light, shimmering with a brilliance that seemed out of place in a world of mud and rot. The American broke off a square and ate it first, a silent universal gesture to prove it was not poisoned. Then he extended the rest toward Sato. The corporal's hands, stained with the soil of the cave and the grease of 1,000 failed maneuvers, trembled as they hovered over the offering. The scent of cocoa and sugar, rich and cloying, hit his nostrils with the force of a physical blow, a sensory overload that bypassed his military conditioning and spoke directly to his starving body. Behind the first soldier, others began to move, but their actions were not those of a firing squad. They were reaching into their packs, pulling out sea rations and heavy, waxed paper containers of water. The sound of the American mess kit, that recurring metallic chime, became the soundtrack of the encounter. It was the sound of abundance. The Americans were not just soldiers, they were the representatives of a nation that could afford to feed its enemies. As the Japanese survivors began to tentatively accept the food, the ideological walls began to crack. A chocolate bar was a weapon of democracy that the Imperial High Command had no counter for. It was tangible evidence of a world that was not dying, but thriving. This simple act of sharing sustenance in the middle of a battlefield was the first fracture in the foundation of the Kichiku myth, a quiet prelude to the profound transformation that would follow as the reality of their survival began to sink in. For Corporal Sato and his shivering men, the period following their initial contact was a waking nightmare of suspense. Despite the offering of chocolate and the presence of water, the deep-seated terror of the expected execution remained the dominant force in their minds. They had been taught that the Westerner was a master of psychological cruelty, and they viewed this sudden kindness not as mercy, but as a deceptive prelude to a more agonizing end. As the American soldiers gestured for them to stand and move toward a waiting truck, the Japanese prisoners complied with the robotic precision of men walking toward their own gallows. They looked for signs of the torture chambers they had been warned about, the pliers, the branding irons, or the mass graves. Every bump of the truck over the uneven island terrain felt like the final jolt before a firing squad's volley. This internal monologue of the POWs was a chaotic storm of shame and anticipation. In their eyes, the Americans were merely fattening them up for a ritualized slaughter. They watched the GIs laugh and joke among themselves, interpreting this casual behavior as the callousness of predators who had already secured their prey. The recurring metallic chime of the American mess kit, the sound of soldiers preparing a meal, rang in their ears like a funeral dirge. To the Japanese mind, the lack of immediate violence was the most unsettling part of the ordeal. They were prepared for the bullet, but they were utterly unequipped for the absence of it. They waited for the Americans to drop the mask of the humanitarian and reveal the beast man underneath, a transition they believed was inevitable once they reached the main camp. Factual historical accounts from this stage of the war reflect a consistent pattern among Japanese captives, a state of psychic numbing. Men like Sato would often remain completely silent for days, convinced that any word spoken would be used against them in a subsequent interrogation involving physical pain. They were trapped in a paradox where their survival felt like a secondary, more prolonged form of death. As they were led into a barbed wire enclosure, they did not see a place of safety. They saw a processing center for the doomed. The ideology of Imperial Japan had provided them with a script for a glorious death, but it had left them with no instructions on how to navigate a life spared by an enemy they had been told was subhuman. They stood in the center of the stockade, shoulders hunched, waiting for the order to kneel, waiting for the heavy, final thud of the executioner's blade that their entire culture had promised was the only honorable end to their story. The tension reached its zenith within the confines of the processing center, a space where the air felt charged with the static of unspoken fear. As Corporal Sato and his men stood rigid, braced for a violent end, a young Nisei corporal, a Japanese-American whose uniform bore the same stripes as their own, stepped into the light of the encampment. He did not carry a weapon, but a clipboard and a canteen. He looked at the bedraggled survivors not with the eyes of a conqueror, but with a profound, quiet recognition. Clearing his throat, he spoke in a dialect of Japanese that was clear, formal, and startlingly gentle. He did not issue a command. He looked Sato directly in the eyes and uttered the words that would shatter the foundations of their psychological conditioning. Anzen da. Mao Anzen da. You are safe now. The phrase hung in the humid air, vibrating with a frequency that the Japanese soldiers were entirely unprepared to process. To men who had spent years hearing only of Gyokusai and the shattered jewel, the concept of safety in the hands of an enemy was a linguistic and emotional impossibility. In the Imperial Japanese Army, safety was a luxury for the dead or the victorious. For the captive, there was only the stain of dishonor. Hearing these words in their native tongue acted as a surgical strike against their indoctrination. It was a verbal key that unlocked a door they had spent their entire lives bolting shut. The recurring metallic chime of the American mess kit, the sound of life being sustained, suddenly changed its meaning. It was no longer the sound of the executioner's dinner. It was the rhythm of a civilization that viewed these men not as beasts, but as human beings who had reached the end of their suffering. The reaction among the prisoners was visceral and immediate. For some, the shock manifest as a physical collapse. Knees that had held firm through artillery barrages gave way under the weight of a single sentence. For Sato, the words felt like a physical heat, a warmth that began at the center of his chest and radiated outward, melting the ice of his stoicism. He looked at the Nisei soldier and saw a mirror of what he could have been, a man of Japanese descent who was neither dead nor disgraced, but standing upright in the service of a different ideal. The phrase, "You are safe now," was more than a guarantee of physical protection. It was an invitation back into the human race. It signaled the end of the war within the soul. Factual records from the period often describe this specific moment as the Great Thaw, where the rigid, death-obsessed identity of the soldier was washed away by the simple, terrifyingly beautiful realization that they were permitted to continue existing. The American abundance, symbolized by the chocolate and the clean water, now found its voice. It was a voice that did not demand their death for the glory of a distant throne, but offered them a place in a world where the primary objective was survival. In that moment, the Kichiku myth died, not with a bang, but with a whispered promise of peace. The sheer scale of American logistics, now fully visible to the captives, functioned as a weapon of peace that the imperial ideology could not withstand. As Corporal Sato was led deeper into the American lines, the landscape shifted from the charred ruins of the battlefield to an industrial miracle. Factual records from the period document the astonishment of Japanese prisoners upon seeing the sea of supply. Miles of stacked crates, endless rows of jeeps, and heavy construction equipment that seemed to reshape the earth itself. This was the arsenal of democracy in its most overwhelming form. For men who had spent years fighting in a military that valued spirit over material, The sight of a single American airfield possessing more heavy machinery than an entire Japanese division was a crushing revelation. It became clear that they had not been fighting a war of equals. They had been fighting a force that possessed a seemingly infinite capacity for production. The recurring symbolic object, the American mess kit, now appeared in the thousands. Sato watched as GIs lined up for hot meals, receiving portions of meat, vegetables, and fruit that exceeded what a Japanese officer might see in a month. This abundance was not merely about calories. It was a testament to a system that prioritized the individual's physical well-being. To the Japanese soldier, who had been taught that suffering was a virtue and that the state owed its servants nothing but the opportunity to die, the American logistical tale was a profound ideological shock. They saw American Seabees building roads and hospitals with a casual efficiency that suggested the war was merely one of many projects they were undertaking. The weakness of democracy, a central pillar of imperial propaganda, was exposed as a fabrication by the very existence of these mountains of supplies. In the prisoner of personnel centers, this abundance translated into a systematic effort to restore the health of the vanquished. Japanese doctors among the POWs were provided with American penicillin and sulfa drugs, medicines that were practically non-existent in the imperial ranks. The prisoners saw that the Americans were not just capable of destruction, but were equally obsessed with reconstruction and maintenance. They observed American soldiers discarding items that would have been priceless treasures in the caves, empty fuel drums repurposed as ovens, or discarded timber used for flooring. This casual relationship with material wealth was more effective at dismantling the Kichiku myth than any battlefield defeat. It suggested a society so powerful that it could afford to be merciful, and so wealthy that it could view its enemies as human beings worthy of care. For Sato, the sight of a warehouse filled with nothing but boots was a moment of total clarity. He realized that the spirit he had been told would conquer all had been pitted against a civilization that had mastered the physical world, and in that mastery had found the capacity to offer life where his own leaders had only offered death. The internal transformation of the Japanese prisoners accelerated as they observed the daily conduct of the American soldiers within the stockades. To men like Corporal Sato, the Imperial Japanese Army was defined by a rigid, often brutal vertical hierarchy. In that system, a superior's strike to a subordinate's face was a standard tool of discipline, and the distance between a private and an officer was an unbridgeable chasm of status. However, as the days turned into weeks, the captives witnessed a different social contract in action. They watched American officers sitting on the bumpers of jeeps, eating the same rations from the same metallic mess kits as their subordinates. They saw enlisted men speaking to lieutenants with a casual, yet functional, respect that lacked the performative terror of the Japanese ranks. This egalitarianism was, to the prisoners, more baffling than the chocolate bars or the heavy artillery. It contradicted the propaganda that democracy was a chaotic, weak system destined to fail against the unified spirit of the East. Documented shifts in perception among Japanese POWs often highlight this specific cultural shock. They noticed that the American guards did not carry themselves with the grim, death-obsessed weight they had been taught was the mark of a true warrior. Instead, the Americans seemed almost bored with the war, frequently showing the prisoners photos of their families or playing impromptu games of baseball in the dust behind the barracks. The sound of the American mess kit, that persistent, rhythmic chime, now became associated with a relaxed humanity. It was the sound of men who were not defined solely by their role as killers, but who were fathers, mechanics, and students temporarily wearing a uniform. For Sato, watching a group of GIs share a cigarette with a Japanese prisoner who had been a tailor before the war was a moment of profound ideological dissonance. The beast-man was capable of empathy, and more importantly, he seemed to possess a sense of individual identity that the imperial system had spent years trying to suppress in its own ranks. This realization led to a slow collapse of the shame that had initially paralyzed the captives. As they saw that the Americans did not view them with the disgust they felt for themselves, they began to cautiously reclaim their own humanity. They participated in work details, helping to clear rubble or organize supplies, and found that their labor was met with a simple "good job" rather than a blow. The ideological architecture of the empire began to seem like a distant, suffocating dream. In the quiet of the night, within the safety of the tents, the prisoners began to talk not of Gyokusai or the emperor, but of their homes in Kyushu or Hokkaido. They were no longer shattered jewels, waiting for a final blow. They were men who had been given the impossible gift of a second life. The American system, for all its material noise and mechanical might, had won its greatest victory not with the flamethrower, but by demonstrating that a man could surrender his weapon without surrendering his soul. Sato realized that the safety he had been promised was not just physical. It was the safety to be a human being once again, free from the crushing obligation of a violent, state-mandated death. The process of rebuilding the human spirit within the stockades was a quiet, methodical labor that mirrored the physical reconstruction of the islands. For Corporal Sato and his men, the passage of time brought a gradual restoration of dignity that they had once thought permanently forfeited. The stockades were no longer viewed as transition points to the grave, but as laboratories of a new existence. In these enclosures, the survivors were provided with clean clothing, sturdy American fatigues that replaced the rotted remnants of their imperial uniforms. This change of dress was deeply symbolic. As they stripped away the grime of the caves, they were also shedding the identity of the shattered jewel. They began to govern their own internal lives again, establishing small gardens and organizing classes to teach one another skills for a post-war world. The sound of the American mess kit, that recurring metallic chime, now signaled the start of a communal ritual, a time where the focus was not on the glory of death, but on the sustenance of the living. Factual historical accounts from these camps reveal a startling shift in the prisoners' internal metrics of value. They began to realize that their lives were valued by their captors more than they had been by their own commanders. While their former generals had viewed them as disposable bullets to be fired into the machinery of war, the American medical teams treated their lingering tropical ulcers and malaria with a level of attention that bordered on the obsessive. This humanitarian investment created a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. Sato watched as American nurses, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a beast man, tended to the youngest soldiers who had been conscripted just months prior. The realization that their survival was a priority for the enemy was the ultimate subversion of their training. They were being taught, through the simple application of medical care and regular nutrition, that the individual had worth independent of the state. Healing was not just physical, it was a reclamation of the future. The prisoners began to create art, carving small figurines from scrap wood or painting scenes of their hometowns on the backs of discarded ration boxes. These acts of creation were a direct defiance of the Gyokusai ideology that had demanded their total destruction. The stockades became spaces where the rigid militaristic culture of Japan began to soften and adapt to the presence of American liberal ideals. Sato found himself looking at the barbed wire not as a cage, but as a protective barrier that had kept the madness of the war at bay while his soul mended. The great thaw was complete. These men, who had crawled out of the darkness expecting the blade, were now standing in the light, planning for a life they had once been forbidden to imagine. They were the first citizens of a new Japan, forged in the fires of defeat but tempered by the unexpected mercy of an enemy who had chosen to say, "You are safe," instead of pulling the trigger. The epilogue of this transformation finds its true meaning not in the survival of the soldiers, but in the rebirth of a nation. As the fires of the Pacific War finally cooled into the embers of the occupation, the thousands of men who had once knelt in the dirt of island clearings began their journey back to a Japan they no longer recognized. They returned to a land that had been physically shattered, yet they carried with them a psychological blueprint for a different kind of future. The Corporal Satos of the war were no longer the vanguard of an expanding empire. They were the humble architects of a peaceful democracy. The indoctrination of the shattered jewel, had been replaced by a quiet, persistent desire for stability and a recognition that the beast-man across the ocean was, in fact, the partner in their reconstruction. The legacy of that mercy is etched into the very foundation of the modern world. The transition from the rigid militaristic autocracy of the 1930s to the egalitarian, industrial powerhouse of the late 20th century can be traced back to those individual moments of contact in the mud and the sun. It was in the gift of a chocolate bar, the share of a canteen, and the steady, reassuring sound of an American mess kit that the cycle of hatred was broken. Those three simple words, "You're safe now," had done more to conquer the Japanese spirit than any number of incendiary bombs. They provided a bridge across a chasm of ideological madness, allowing a generation of men to step out of the shadow of a mandatory death and into the responsibility of a voluntary life. Ultimately, this historical episode serves as a poetic reflection on the nature of freedom and the overwhelming power of abundance. It reveals a larger truth, that the most effective way to defeat an ideology of despair is not to destroy its adherents, but to offer them a version of the world where their existence is valued. The American soldiers who offered bread instead of bullets were practicing a form of diplomacy that transcended politics. They were demonstrating that the greatest strength of a free society lies in its capacity for humanitarianism. As the veterans of the Pacific Theater grew old and the battlefields were reclaimed by the jungle, the echoes of that metallic chime remained, a reminder that in the darkest hours of human conflict, the most radical act one can perform is an act of simple, sustained kindness. The safety once promised in a coral clearing became the peace of a continent, a testament to the fact that when a man is told he is safe, he finally has the freedom to become a man again.